this event. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our today's meeting, which is taking place as part of the research project Non-Anthropocentric Cultural Subjectivity, and has been organized by the Environmental Humanities Center at the Faculty of Modern Languages of the University of Warsaw. Our activities, which I have the honor to coordinate, want to be perceived as a space for interdisciplinary discussion about the relations between the human and more than human worlds, about the non-anthropocentric subjectivity and non-human agencies going beyond the established boundaries of humanistic discourses toward a lively exchange with representatives of other scientific ways of describing the world. We treat this interdisciplinarity as an essential cognitive tool and try to practice it in individual projects. We are therefore, for example, very glad that we could organize our conference on plant studies in cooperation with the Department of Botany of the Warsaw University of Life Sciences. That the work on the translation and editing of Karen Barat's book on their agential realist interpretation of quantum physics has been consulted and discussed with specialists in the field of quantum theory from the Faculty of Physics of our university, and that our investigations into evolutionary aesthetics, as well as the event tonight, have recently attracted interest from eminent scholars, biologists in Poland and abroad. These are just a few examples of our interdisciplinary approach and going beyond the boundaries of the humanities. Today's event, the next edition of the Ecopoetological Laboratory, is also part of this practice. The Ecopoetological Laboratory was created by two of my wonderful colleagues, Professor Julia Fiedorczuk and Professor Gerardo Beltran, and has been part of our activities from the very beginning. Since 2020, the laboratory has been hosting encounters with outstanding poets, artists, activists, and scholars whose activities engage the problematics of ecopoetics, understood broadly as a field of the human and non-human ways of world-making in the Anthropocene. The current planetary crisis questions the received anthropocentric definitions of creativity, agency, and sense. Therefore, the laboratory aims to examine alternative ways of articulating these issues which are beginning to emerge in contemporary science, art, and poetry. One such alternative is a close and authentic dialogue between these fields, which may prove fruitful for each of them. Tonight, we will be involved in such a dialogue performed by our distinguished guests, who will now be introduced by Julia Fiedorczuk.
Okay, thank you, Professor Piszczatowski. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight, and welcome to this talk. I have to say that this is a very, very special night for me. I'm super excited about having both of you here. I have to say that Forrest Gander has been, over the years, one of the most important influences on my work, on my practice, both as a writer and as a researcher. And Anne Pringle is just this aspiration, is just this role model for a scientist who can speak to people in this incredibly accessible way that's at the same time not simplistic. So I'll just very briefly introduce our guests and in order not to make it too long. Anne Pringle earned her Ph.D. in Botany and Genetics at Duke University. After completing a Miller Institute for Basic Research in Science Fellowship at the University of California at Berkeley, she joined the faculty at Harvard University. Next, she moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she is now Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor in the departments of Botany and Bacteriology. Anne Pringle has a great gift for communicating science to wide audiences. She has given over 100 invited talks to both academic and popular audiences in countries including China, Colombia, France, Singapore, Sweden, Thailand, and the United States. She has been awarded numerous awards both for her research and for her teaching. Her research has been featured by the New York Times, National Public Radio, and the Wisconsin State Journal, among many other places. In 2019, Anne Pringle was elected president of the Mycological Society of America. So please welcome Anne Pringle. And Forrest Gander is a writer and translator with degrees in geology and literature. Before becoming a full-time poet, he taught at Harvard and Brown universities. His books, often concerned with ecology, include Be With, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and Twice Alive, both of which have been translated into Polish. The Polish translation of Twice Alive, Podwojone Życie, has just been published by wydawnictwo Ossolineum. Actually, it premieres at bookstores today. Forrest Gander's other books include Rush to the Lake, Eye Against Eye, Core Samples from the World, and Eiko and Koma, which is inspired by the work of two Japanese-born dancers, choreographers. And that shows one of the important features of Gander's work, that it often involves collaboration with other writers, artists, or with scientists, as in the case of Twice Alive. As a character on one of Forrest Gander's novels puts it, poetry has nothing to say, poetry listens. It listens to diverse human and non-human voices. The polyphonic character of Gander's work reflects the fact that every identity is made up by multiple agents, processes, and beings. Forrest Gander is also a translator, translating from Japanese and Spanish. He published numerous books by Mexican women poets, especially, for instance, Coral Bracho, a super important poet based in Mexico City. His essayistic books include A Faithful Existence, a collection of writings on the relation between science and literature, and Red Start, an ecological poetics, which was written in collaboration with John Kinsella. So please welcome Forrest Gander. Okay, so now the floor is yours.
So we thought we would start out by introducing you to our own sort of introductory, our own introductory adventure in what came to be a kind of collaboration. So we were invited by a literary scholar named Lynn Keller, who is who taught at University of Wisconsin, and is the author of a terrific book on ecopoetics and the self-conscious Anthropocene. And she decided to invite an artist, a poet, and a scientist to a very special area near Lake Huron, so between Canada and the US, that huge Great Lake, that in the late 1800s, about 1890, was bought by 50 wealthy American families who were worried that because of their own industries, which included timber cutting industries, that there wouldn't be enough forest left for them to hunt in. And so they pooled their money and bought this this pristine forest area, and they had the good fortune of asking an important naturalist, Aldo Leopold, about how to maintain this land. And so it's some 22,000 acres, 10,000 of which is old growth forest, and it's been perfectly preserved. Although it's still in private hands, they've allowed researchers to come and use the and do investigations in this pristine forest. So this is where we hung out and slept, the Huron Mountain Club headquarters, and that's the lake that I first saw Anne swimming in. This is the first day of going out. This is Anne's graduate students, and we were looking at lichen and taking collections of mushrooms. This is a video that you won't be able to see because the file is corrupted. So you have to imagine that that finger down by that little round thing, which is a puff ball, is going to touch that puff ball, and there'll be an explosion of spores coming out like smoke. Was that exciting so far? Right. Anne, what's this?
I don't know. This is a young mushroom. Actually, oh, yeah. Can I use this mic? Is that okay? I have nothing for you on this one. It's it's covered with moss, and it's either very young or very old. I can't decide.
Oh, this one I have a good story with. This is a lion's mane that we found and harvested and cooked that night in butter and ate, and it was delicious. Oh, these are good stories.
Yeah, these are blue stain fungi. I'm guessing that you have these in Poland too. They stain the wood blue, and woodworkers use them. The wood is highly prized because you can make marquetry, or you can make patterns in with little pieces of wood that are blue that you set with other little pieces of wood in mosaics. So that's some sort of Leucoagaricus. And this is a lichen. This is a very special lichen because when the habitat becomes polluted, this is one of the first kinds of lichens to disappear. And it's a Lobaria species, a lung. They call it a lung lichen, like a lung, like you breathe with, because of this natural history.
So, as many of you know, lichen is an indicator for pollution. It's very sensitive, and so where you see a lot of it, it's often a healthy environment.
Yeah. And there, actually, what's fun about this picture to me is in the base, there's that little red mushroom. That's, I think, probably a russula that hasn't opened up yet. But the colors, the green is an algae that's growing on top of it's a Trichaptum violaceum, I think. Can you see the purple at the edges of the fungus, of the shelf-like fungus? And then the green is yet another thing growing on top of the fungus, all growing out of decomposing wood. That's a Ganoderma and me.
You can see how happy it makes her.
That's a destroying angel. These are vivid white in the forest, and you can see them. They're alabaster white. You can see them from very far away, and they are deadly if you eat them.
They're like these holy things because the light hits them in the shady forest, and it's just this white visionary death angel, waiting for you. So one of the things that was most interesting to me on this adventure, I had grown up without a father, and my mother was a school teacher, so I had a lot of free time as a kid, and I spent it all in the woods. And I knew my trees and my animals, my amphibians. I even had pet leeches. But it wasn't until I was with Anne in the forest that I saw how much life I hadn't seen, and that the lichen and mushrooms were everywhere around me, and I'd never noticed.
One of the students, Savannah, is working on a disease that's emerging on snakes, snake fungal disease, and she's somewhat obsessed with snakes. So the idea of a snake, although I don't think the snake would hurt you, but the idea of a snake next to a destroying angel made us all laugh very much, and we all tried to get photos.
It's a garter snake.
Yeah, and this is some of the anatomy of an Amanita mushroom. So you can see what's called the partial veil. So this covering would have covered the spores. It would have been almost like a sheet of fabric around the spores, and at this point it's dropped. And so when it drops, the gills and the spore-bearing surface are exposed, and that's what you're looking at. And that's some kind of coral fungus. Those are also very hard. One of the things, there's a couple of things when you're walking in the woods with people. One is, this is the most common feedback I get after teaching mycology classes or teaching about fungi, is people say, I see them everywhere now. It's something that somehow, but I suspect in Poland it's quite different because you all have more of a tradition of hunting mushrooms. So I think that you all will, yeah. But in the U.S. we don't. So for many people, they're invisible until somehow they're made visible, and then you really notice them. And the other thing is that the joke is that you're not really a fungus unless you've been through at least 3 name changes in the last 10 years, which is true. So some of these things I'm quite content to just say it's a coral fungus, and whatever name I gave you would either be for the future or already out of date. So. Some sort of Russula. Beautiful. Yeah, some sort of hydnellum. There's a song about hydnellum, and the chorus of the song is this hydnellum's only song? And every time I see hydnellum, I think about that song, which I think is hydnellum's only song. And lichen fields, yeah. And Amanita that's eaten somehow, which is interesting. We can think about what eats mushrooms besides us.
So the sharp edges are the area that's been eaten away.
Something very tiny. This is a plant, actually, and it's a plant that has lost the ability to photosynthesize. So the idea is that the roots of this plant tap into the fungal network in the soil and take carbon from the fungus. So that's how the plant feeds itself. And we could talk about whether it's a parasitism or not. Oh, this is a cordyceps. Okay, so now I'll do the thing which I've resisted for a year. How many people have seen The Last of Us? Okay, this is the fungus, more or less, that inspires that series. It's a parasite on insects, so you have to dig this out super carefully, and eventually you'll find the body of the insect that's been taken over. But they're not always parasitic on insects. Sometimes they're parasitic on truffle fungi. It could be either. Another Amanita, the yellow Amanita muscaria. Yeah. I don't want to talk too much.
Okay, yeah. And we came back to the lab and labeled all of these and did some experiments with them. And Emily Arthur, a Native American artist, began to work with the collection and began to make molds and and make molds that she filled with brass to make brass mushrooms that she then placed on beds of moss, and those beds of moss and her drawings will go into a book, an artist book, that will be more expensive than any of us can afford, but very, very beautiful. And then the adventure produced this book, which was translated by some brilliant poet here in Warsaw. Okay.
So now should we do the science bit?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, switching gears. Okay, does it work? Can you hear me? Okay, so speaking of different practices, I'm not very good at sitting and talking, so I'm actually going to stand and pace around and talk and look at it with you. So, and I'm also actually going to look at my phone because I'm setting a limit to myself of 15 minutes. Oh, actually, I can see on there. Okay, great. So I'm not going to answer questions, or I will answer your questions later, but I'm going to ask some questions in this talk and in this little mini portion of the talk, and I'm not going to answer them. But Forrest and I were talking, and we thought it might be a good flavor to give you some idea of why I ask the questions that I do, and what are the kinds of approaches or the practice, I think is we don't use that word in science, but I know that it's used in other places. What practice do I have? So one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on, and I should also say, right, these are all works in progress. So when you have data and you're thinking about it, you can change your mind. So I'll give you a version which I think is true today, and then as I think, maybe things will change. And in case you don't know, that bird, that blue-gray gnatcatcher, the nest of that bird is made out of lichens. Can you see them? So, and this is just to make a point that lichens are a part of our world in ways that we sometimes don't suspect. And this photograph was actually taken by my father. So in 2005, so maybe everyone can take a moment and think about where they were in 2005, because it's now 2023. I began a somewhat crazy project. I work in a cemetery, and also I didn't mean it to be quite so poetic. I'll explain it as I go along. But the point is that tombstones are flat, and because they are flat, the lichens that grow on them grow with a very regular rhythmic pattern that I can measure. So I began work in the cemetery, and I basically am trying to understand how frequently lichens are born on a tombstone, how they grow, and whether they die. That's the question. So demographic data that biologists often collect for humans and birds and snakes and insects and all kinds of things. But remarkably, no one has done that in quite this way for lichens before. So that's what I wanted to do. So, and this slide illustrates for you lichens on a tombstone, and you can see them, right? You can count them, and you can see, I mean, sometimes it's a little bit more complicated, right? There is, for example, you can see in the middle there are, or bottom right, you can see some lichens that have grown into each other, and so their geometry has changed. They're not so circular anymore, and we could talk about that. It's very interesting how that happens and how those shapes are formed. But the point is, I can see them, I can count them, I can measure their shapes. And so originally the motivation for this so many years ago was this observation that fungi are supposed to be immortal. And to make that more precise, when a human gets older, as time passes, our probability of death increases, right? But when you're 90, you're more likely to die in any given year than a 15-year-old. And maybe that's not true for a lichen. And if that's not true, not only is that really interesting, but I want to know why. What is it that makes that lichen not susceptible to aging? And the only way to do that, actually carefully, is to first understand these patterns of birth and growth and death. You somehow have to understand something about how populations grow in nature, and how individuals grow in nature before you can make grand pronouncements about they're immortal or they're not immortal or whatever is going on. So as I said, I'm not going to answer that question today. But this was the whole idea. And I worked with these lichens. They're Xanthoparmelia lichens. We could talk about how many species they are. Over time, I've become very resistant to naming things or providing you or anyone with any kind of information about species labels for lots of reasons that we could also talk about. So I'll just use the word Xanthoparmelia. And lichens are, of course, symbioses. So what you're looking at here is a cross section. So I cut through the middle of the lichen. I made a very thin piece of it, and then I stained it with ink. And you can see that on the left-hand side, there's a sort of, I guess, a more or less smooth layer on top. And then can you see there are round, dark circles? Those round, dark circles are algae. So those are you can think about them as plant-like creatures because they photosynthesize. So they fix carbon dioxide from the air using the energy of the sun, and they provide that fixed carbon, that food, to the fungus. And more or less the rest of what you're looking at is a fungus that provides the scaffold of the lichen. Anyway, the point is that they're symbioses. And when I started giving talks about this in probably around 2010, I used to have to then spend a lot of time justifying to people why I studied lichens. And I would go to elaborate lengths to say that, you know, it's really like studying humans, where I know it's a symbiosis. I don't have to give that speech anymore because the world has changed and we now understand that humans are also worlds and we are not sterile. We would die if we were sterile. So a lichen is a symbiosis. I'm a symbiosis too. If I can study humans, I can also study lichens. It doesn't make it irrelevant or uninteresting or negate the study of lichens, which I think honestly has happened for decades. One of the reasons people haven't studied lichens is because they're symbioses. And so somehow we dismiss them as unique or odd or strange or something. So anyway, so there haven't been a whole lot of people studying how they grow in nature. This is the cemetery where I do my work. And I do have permission from the people who are buried here, their families. I have permission from their families to work here. I'm quite thoughtful and careful about that, just to say that out loud. And most of them are actually dead biologists. So when I'm a dead biologist, I want to be in the ground with a huge tombstone, and I want someone to come and study the lichens that grow on my tombstone. So no problem there. It was a pretty funny and short conversation with the families about it. And so the materials and methods, I wasn't sure that this was going to work when I started, so I have more or less done all the work by myself with some critical support from a few graduate students along the way, but I wanted to protect everybody else from involvement in this work. So I just would go out every fall. Here's Ernie Gould, he was a past director of Harvard Forest, and his wife Anna. And I would take this tracing paper you can see on the right, and there's coffee and there's pens, and there's really, it's not complicated. And I would make a tracing. So this is a sheet of plastic that I would lay over the tombstone, and the tracings that you see are the lichens. So if you want to think about it this way, it's a map. And then every year, once a year, I would take last year's map, and I would go and I would retrace the thalli, the individuals, and then over time, you get something that looks like this. So this is an individual on the French tombstone, individual number 13, and you can see the black, blue, pink, red, blue. That's the changing of that lichen over time. And in the inset there is a space that I was taking natural history notes on. And I do that a lot. And so this is what the tombstone looks like when I've got it all marked up with sticky tape from the last year's map. And this was also, those 3 little dots are just to indicate to you that my eyesight used to be better than an Air Force pilot's, so I didn't need glasses. Anyway, I could see really little things. And this is another thing that I used to have to justify all the time, is that I could witness a birth, that it was possible to do such a thing. And because I would go once a year, I do have confidence that I captured the birth rate pretty successfully. So, and here then is a video of a lichen growing over a decade. So this is 10 years worth of data. Which I'm really proud of. It's a really unusual thing to be able to see a lichen grow like that. So, but the point that I really wanted to make today maybe was more about the complications of studying them. So this is an individual in September 2011. Actually, we can all think about 9/11. That's, of course, for an American, top of mind when I put that date up. And this is what happened in a month. So something happened. I don't know what. I suspect that someone who was caretaking the grass in the cemetery cut this like in a part with a weed, what we call a weed whacker. I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, you can see that it was blown away. So the point here is what I would count on this date is different from what I would see or how I would count on this date. And this is what it looked like then some years later. So at these 3 different time points, I see I might have 3 very different interpretations if I hadn't been following this individual over time. There it is in the layout. And just to give you another example, this is, I know it's pixelated, but this was an individual in 2005, and it's entire and whole, it has integrity. And then in 2006, something happened. Again, I don't know what. But can you see that there's sort of also a ghost of the former body there? If I go back and forth, you can see, which is also interesting and characteristic of this group. And then over time, it grew back. So here, I would have said, I would have counted 1. Here, I would have counted 3. Here, I would have had to think a lot, but I probably would have counted 4, I think. And there's a birth happening in the bottom right. But then over time, it looks entire and whole again. So as I said, I'm not going to answer any questions, but this is a lot of what I spend my time thinking about. What is an organism? What is an individual? How to count? With birds, it seems so obvious. I wonder whether it is as obvious for birds as sometimes we make it out to be. But certainly with lichens, it illustrates the complexities of doing this kind of natural history. And so one of the strong conclusions I've come to is that a lichen is an organism but not an individual. So as an organism, it has emergent properties of all the things that make it up, but the individuals are within it. And I know the word individual is used in all kinds of ways in all kinds of fields, but this is the conclusion that I've come to. All right, so now I'm going to take you to a totally different place and a totally different research program. So here we go. So we're no longer on the east coast of the United States in Massachusetts. We're now on the west coast of the United States. So lichens are really my passion. This is the thing that I think about a lot, I read about a lot, think about a lot. But we are in the midst of something bigger than us that's happening on our planet. So over time, my research has also shifted to what I describe as bearing witness. And I bear witness to the changes in biogeography that are happening among fungi. So one of the things that you will be told is that the species that I find in the forest this coming weekend in Poland, that I will be given a name. And then when I go to Wisconsin, someone will give me that same name for something I find in Wisconsin, and it's not true. It's a legacy of how few people study fungi and how the names in the US were given. It's a colonial history. People with European guidebooks came to Wisconsin. And because the morphology of fungi is complicated, they gave the local things European names. So the destroying angel, someone will tell you it's Amanita virosa. We don't have Amanita virosa. That's not a species, that's a European species. So there's a really complex history of names that's very human and not okay. Meanwhile, there are things like European death caps, which are European Amanita phalloides, that are being introduced and are now invasive in California. But this is something that I find that most people aren't aware of, that fungi have a biogeography. It's not true that everything is everywhere. It's just not true. So if you go to these forests in California, actually not too far away from where Forrest lives, these beautiful coast live oak woodlands, and this is my team launching themselves up the mountain. If you go, what you'll find are these fungi, which are Amanita phalloides European death caps. So another thing that I'm trying to do is understand what makes these invasive mushrooms successful. And my history is the history of botany. And because we don't really have a field of invasive mushrooms, back to the theme of bearing witness, what belongs where, what isn't there now, I turned to these old books by a guy named Herb Baker, who thought about the ideal weed. So I also think about, I love that he added a question mark. So I'm thinking about the ideal weed mushroom. And so we've been doing this with genomes. This is my student, Yanwen Wang, recently graduated. So we basically sequence genomes, and we try to understand natural history by looking at genetic data. And so one of the things we've discovered, Forrest, do you think it's okay if I take another 3 minutes? I feel like, okay, sorry. So I'm gonna teach you this right now. So can you see how there are 2 round circles, white, black spores? Each of those will germinate. And in a traditional life cycle, what happens is those 2 bodies, those 2 mycelia fuse. But the nuclei stay apart from each other. This is radically different from human biology. Your nuclei, you only have 1 in each of your cells, 1 from your biological mother, 1 from your biological father. Those nuclei that you got from your biological parents are fused in you. They are a single nucleus, they're fused. But these guys are not fused. And so the way I talk about it is they're living together, but they have not committed to marriage. And they can and they do leave each other and go off to different bodies. But this idea is controversial, and so now I'm gonna show you my data. So these guys made the choice to live together, these nuclei, black and white, and it's that dikaryotic, 2 nucleus, dikaryotic, 2 nuclei body that makes the mushrooms, and it's inside the mushrooms then that there's this phenomenon called meiosis that makes the spores. So all the women in this room, all the people who have uteruses, I made my eggs when I was inside my biological mother's womb. If you don't know that, that's true. So all of my eggs were made before I was born. Men make sperm, people with penises make sperm continuously. So the pace and the dynamic, I mean, that's meiosis. So in humans, it happens long ago and far away is the point. Whereas in a fungus, it doesn't happen long ago and far away. It happens immediately before the next generation is made. Okay, I hope I've carried some of, if nothing else, I want you to understand that this is radically different biology, and that the sort of dynamics of mating and he and she just doesn't work. And there's just no point to make the language try to work. It's up to us to think differently about how this happens. So that's why I'm trying to be very careful with my word choice for that reason. But what we discovered is that in California, where their death caps are invasive, there are some death caps that have no genetic variation whatsoever in their genomes, in their bodies. And it turns out what's going on is that instead of having 2 nuclei, black and white, which is what's supposed to happen, they only have 1 kind of nucleus. So these are bodies that make mushrooms without mating with anybody else. They're unisexual is what we call it. They're not bisexual. So again, if some of these words aren't making much sense, just know that there are some death caps in California some bodies that have decided they don't need to mate. They don't need to fuse with anybody else. They can reproduce by themselves. And I think that this flexibility in mating is a key to why they're successful. And these are nuclei that live a very long time. So one of them we've tracked from 2014 to 2021, and another from 2004 to 2021. 2021 is the last time we measured. Actually, Forrest, you were with us when we were collecting these guys. So this is a very unusual body, and it really, again, back to the theme of individuality, there are now in this fungus at least 2 levels of individuality. There's the body, right? And the body can either have 2 nuclei or 1 nucleus. And then within the body, there's a nucleus that has its own independent behavior and also acts as an individual moving across different bodies. So that's a lot to absorb, I know. But it's different. And these guys look totally normal. These mushrooms look totally normal. The last thing I'll show you, and I think I'm just going to skip ahead because I really don't want to take too much time, is that unlike the mushrooms that are bisexual and have 2 nuclei, black and white, these ones often have really unusual structures in their mushrooms. So here's one that just has 1 spore at the end, not the canonical 4 spores at the end of the cell that makes spores. So if you're into mushrooms, this is more or less like pornography to show. It's like so bizarre. Like you really can't get over it. And they also have really unusual patterns of nuclear behavior. And so I'm just gonna play this video. These nuclei are stained now. And again, just this is a radically different arrangement or organization of nuclei. There should be one nucleus per spore. There should not be nuclei in the originating cell. Nothing about this is normal or okay. But what I would say is that I've just discovered something that probably is absolutely normal. It's just that it hasn't been looked at in quite this way before. And so because I'm a scientist, back to the theory of practice, I also have to end by acknowledging because it's never an I. Like you say we have a collaboration. Forrest wrote the poetry. I'm in the acknowledgements, just to be clear. This is a little bit different because scientists really cannot, there's no creation without the team. So this is the team and the funding that gets us where we need to go. And now I'm handing it back to you. Or no, thank you. Diversity again.
So what she's just talked about is similar to what I'm going to talk about in a different realm. But what she's talking about is how attentiveness can change our language, and as our language changes, so do our ideas about the world, about relationships. And that's kind of the goal of what's come to be called eco-poetics also. So I'd like to talk about eco-poetics a little bit. I don't want to sacrifice, I have a degree in geology too, and I'm not going to sacrifice scientific objectivity to the so-called interior life. But in defense of our so-called interior life, I would like to try to make the case that the perceived world is not just the sum of its objects. And it seems to me that the cultural dimensions of identity and selfhood are inseparable from the dimensions of the ecological. For many indigenous communities in Latin America, for instance, territory itself is agential. It has agency and is integral to the people's identity. Our identity as animals or as mere fellow citizens of this breathing biosphere has often been obscured by religious dogma regarding our special likeness and dearness to God and our superiority as a species, a superiority that we measure in terms that are strictly human-centered. The American author Henry Miller once wrote that people prefer to believe in and worship a God who is remote rather than live out the godlike nature which is their inherent being. As regards to our superiority to other species, the scholar Jane Bennett notes that the bacteria in the human microbiome collectively possess at least 100 times as many genes as the mere 20,000 or so in the human genome, which is to say that we are a mongrel, an amalgamation, not a pure thing. We've been hearing warnings about ecological crisis for more than half a century. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published in 1962 when I was 6. Everyone here has read the bad news: acidifying oceans, the death of coral reefs, the melting of glaciers, the so-called Great Pacific Garbage Patch, climate change, expanding deserts, the current extinction rate of between 150 and 200 species every day. Given the existential threat heralded by the new climate regime, How are we to counter imminent disaster? What kinds of subjectivities need to be forged, human or non-human, that can respond? What kind of aesthetic forms might need to be invented? Scientists have been feeding us the facts of ecological collapse for most of our lives, and yet the facts alone haven't been persuasive enough for us to make the kind of changes our cultures need to make. Perhaps the sociological, scientific, and journalistic language for dealing with this crisis has been insufficient. If so, maybe literature, including poetry, has a role to play. Can poetry resensitize us to a more clear understanding of our place in the world? Can it help us rewrite history and rewire human consciousness, which is sort of what Anne is doing? As globalization draws us together, and industrialization and human population pressures take their toll on natural habitats, as species of plants and animals flicker and are snuffed from the earth, it's worthwhile for us to ask whether an ethnocentric view of human beings as a species independent from others is what underpins our exploitation of natural resources and sets into motion these dire consequences. What we've perpetrated on the environment has certainly affected a writer's means and material. But really, can poetry be ecological? Is there some way it can display or be invested with values that acknowledge the economy of interrelationship between the human and non-human realms? Aside from issues of theme and reference, how could syntax or line break or the shape of the poem on the page express some kind of ecological ethics? If our perceptual experience is mostly palimpsestic or endlessly juxtaposed and fragmented, if events rarely have discrete beginnings or endings, but only layers, duration, and transitions, if natural processes are already altered by and responsive to human observation, how does poetry register the complex interdependency that draws us into a dialogue with the world? In Polish, as in English, and in most Eastern and Western literatures, there are long traditions of the pastoral, poetry centered on nature or landscape. But I myself am less interested in so-called nature poetry, where nature features mainly as a theme, than in poetry, sometimes called eco-poetry, which investigates both thematically and formally the relation between nature and culture, language, and perception. I'm not going to propose that there's any way of writing that gets it right in the way that scientific description supposedly gets it right. As we know, the history of science is a history of revision. I'm not sure that any kind of language, mathematical or poetic, is capable of fully enacting a union between linguistic meaning and phenomenal reality. The expressions writers use to describe the world are never going to be adequate. Compost is no more a model of nature than geometrical symmetry, say a housefly's eye, or strict mathematical progression, like the Fibonacci number sequence. Metaphor points to likeness, not the thing itself, so no metaphorical definition will be authoritative. A strict Petrarchan sonnet might as readily suggest to a reader the rigid imposition of authorial control as the humbling sublimation of a writer's choices to a larger, because conventional, expressive pattern. But metaphor can expand our sense for and imagination of relationship. And what science and philosophy keep showing us is that there is no solitary thing, only relationships. Maybe the development of environmental literacy, by which I mean a capacity for reading connections between the environment and its inhabitants, can be promoted by poetic literacy. Poetry doesn't simply supplement the rational intellect, but provides inherently and sometimes incommensurable forms of insight. Because its meanings are neither quantitative or verifiable the way that science must be, poetry is able to offer different, subtler, more heuristic, jumping levels, expressions than the so-called purer languages of information and commerce. So unlike every other literary or artistic movement that you can name, most of which originated in a single city, often Paris, before they began to spread, and most of which were founded by a small group of men, ecopoetics has flourished all at once, all over the world, and from the start it's been represented by writers of all genders. Among the most distinctive of these writers are Inger Christensen from Denmark, Harriet Tarlow and Zoe Scolding from the United Kingdom, Franz Joseph Czernin in Germany, Anja Utler in Austria, Coral Bracho, Alfonso de Quino, Yaxkin Melchi in Mexico, John Kinsella, Stuart Cook in Australia, in Poland, Julia Fiedorczuk, in Sweden, Mats Solderlund, in Chile, Cecilia Vicuña and Raúl Zorita, and in the United States I can name dozens, including Brenda Hillman and Jory Graham. If language does affect the way that we think about being in the world, poetry can make something happen. It's incontrovertibly influenced the way I experience the world, but it probably doesn't affect perception nearly as much as poets wish. Getting rid of a capital I or eliminating pronouns altogether, deconstructing normative syntax, making the word wordy, those techniques are all more than 100 years old, and they certainly impact the reader, but the effects are intricate and tenuous and may not correspond to a writer's intentions at all. Two recent scientific studies interest me, and although they aren't dog-in-the-sun proofs, that's a Southern American expression, a dog-in-the-sun proof, they may register support for the argument that language perception and conception are irrevocably interconnected. Many of you are probably already familiar with the highly publicized work of Daniel Everett, who reported on the cultural constraints of grammar and cognition in the Paraha, an Amazonian Brazilian tribe, for whom linguistic communication is restricted to, quote, the immediate experience of the speakers. Their language doesn't have a perfect tense. It doesn't allow the possibility of embedding, putting one phrase like this one inside another. They have no numbers, no concept of counting beyond one, two, and many, no color terms, no abstractions, no myths, and no sense of history going back beyond one or two generations. Despite 100 years of contact with Portuguese-speaking Brazilians, they remain monolingual because their language does not allow for experience beyond the experience of the speakers. They don't say, when someone in a canoe disappears around the bend of a river, he's gone from sight. They say, he's gone from experience. Another study involves the Aymara of Bolivia, and this interests me in particular because I've co-translated two books by the Bolivian visionary poet Jaime Sáenz, and he was influenced strongly by the Aymara language and culture. In the Aymara language, it's impossible to say something like, in 1079, King Boleslav II of Poland was banished for murdering Bishop Stanislaus. It is impossible to even say this because that sentence is unqualified by anyone's experience, and because every sentence in Aymara must express whether an action or event was personally witnessed or if it was hearsay. According to Rafael Núñez, a cognitive scientist at University of California, the Aymara is the only studied culture for which the past is linguistically and conceptually in front of them, while the future lies behind them. To speak of the future, elderly Aymara men thumb or wave back over their shoulder. To reference the past, they'll make forward sweeping motions with their hands. The main word for eye, front, and sight in Aymara means the past, while the basic word for back or behind also means the future. In a culture that privileges a distinction between seen and unseen, and known and unknown, to the extent that they weave evidential requirements into the language, perhaps it makes sense to metaphorically place the past in front of you, in your field of view, and the unknown, unknowable future behind your back. In these cases, there seems to be a close relationship between the particularities of language and the perceptions and conceptions of the speakers of that language. Perhaps, instead of tasking poetry or literature with the responsibility for modeling ecologies, as science is said to do, we should look for poems to take responsibility for certain trajectories of thought and intuition, precisely as the critic Charles Altieri notes, by inviting audiences to see what powers they take on as they adapt themselves to how the texts ask to be read. If that's the case, ecopoetics, ecopoets, have a signal role to fulfill in our time. And I'll finish with a little video poem. Incidentally, I wrote that all in Polish and then translated it myself, so any mistakes that you heard are due to the translator.
Unto ourselves, to see what's there and not already patterned by familiarity, for an unpredicted whole is there, casting a pair of shadows, manipulating its material, advancing, assembling enough kinship that we call it life, our life, what is already many lives, the dimensions of its magnitude veiled to us as we live it. Across the cytoplasm of adjacent cells goes a signal that turns you toward me, turns me into you. We are coupled in quiet tumult, convergent arguments, an alien rhythm becoming familiar, a rhythm of I am here, never to be peeled away. We are become one thing, listening for what's there and not. Through the storm, neem trees on the hill stamp wildly in their roots. We have passed through the spring, but what thing has passed through us? Now your laughter transparentizes me, and whose sense of the self doesn't swerve? Your unconditional foreignness grows conditional, stops being foreign at all. With your nearness, my lens on the world shifts. A peristaltic contraction courses through us as a single wave. No longer can we keep our distance, our lips brush, or the tips of ourselves. But what language are you whispering to me, your teeth stained by Nilgiri tea, above the trills and whistles in the high limbs, above the screech of a bulldozer blade, shoving rubble up the wounded street, above the silence of an eyeless tick climbing a grass stem? I understand nothing but the lust your voice incites, the declamatory tenderness. How and who can say what force has queued up this hour for our small voices to merge into a carnality that did not exist before now? Come to this unforeseen conjunction, we slip into one another, we take hold in a pulse of heat, in a yes and no, for already we can see we are no longer what we were. As I find you within me, not fused, not bonded, but lodged. And for you, is it the same? the intensity of such investment, each of us excited by the volatility of the other, which propels us in a rush as something, perhaps our lips brush or the tips of ourselves, stripping away what? What was before? Was there even anything before? The reconfiguration is instantaneous experience. It is being itself. But whose being now? Was I endowed with some special pliability so that becoming part of you, I didn't pass through my own nihilation? And what does the death of who you were mean to me, except that now you are present constantly? Because excess is what it took for us to transform, to effulge. You cast your life beyond itself. Can't you sense me with your ecstatic openness, like rain mingling with red earth? Without you I survived, and with you I live again in a radical augmentation of identity, because we have effaced our outer limits, because we summoned each other. In you, I cast my life beyond itself.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I can press the button.
Can you hear me?
We can always hear you.
Thanks a lot for these wonderful presentations. I would like to open the floor to questions, but perhaps I'll ask the first one actually, if it's okay with everybody, because I wanted to ask you, Forrest, to talk a little bit about how lichen comes into Twice Alive. If you could talk about the title of this volume. That's the book that we now also have in Polish. And so if you could talk about the title and how lichen and mushrooms that Anne taught you about, how they get into the poems, and maybe a little bit about the Sangam.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Do you need this, or?
I can use this.
I'm going to put a lichen back up just so we have visual candy.
Twice Alive. I mean, one thing, I was writing this book after the death of my wife of 35 years, and thinking about how in a long relationship, in a long intimacy, something happens like what Anne was talking about in the lichen, that in a lichen two and more than two things come together, and they relinquish what they were. They can't go back to what they were, and they're changed in their interaction with the other permanently. And I was thinking how much like human intimacy that is, that when we become close with someone, we penetrate through all of them. They penetrate through all of us. And we live again as a mutuality that also doesn't die. So that's part of the title. What was the other question that you asked?
The other question was about, the question was about how what you learned about the lichen gets into some of the poems. So if there's anything.
So lichen becomes a metaphor, and just a metaphor. Anne's a hard scientist, and she's wary of metaphors, because metaphors make you look away from what is. And that's true. That's why William Carlos Williams says that the coining of analogies is a pastime of the lowest order. And yet, analogies are the way that the human mind works. We ask, Oh, you've got a new boyfriend. What's he like? We look for patterns, and so we look for comparisons. And I'm losing my way.
Yeah, and just the second half of my question was about the Sangam. If you could explain that, because I think that's very new, and in the context of this book, I think it's important.
Right. So a lot of the film that you saw comes from southern India, where I've been spending time in the last number of years, and always looking for both models of artists and writers who, as they get older, don't just repeat themselves, whose work keeps fresh, who find ways to keep living, and also looking for other models of thinking about human relationships in a non-logocentric ways, in cultures that didn't prioritize a hierarchy of humans over the rest of the creatures of the world. And there was this blossoming of literature in southern India 2,000 years ago, between 300 AD and 300 BC and 300 AD, which came to be called Sangam, which means convergence. And a part of that literature is Akam, A-K-A-M, which in which it was considered not only not a cool thing to do, not an ethical thing to do, but an impossible thing to do would be to write about human emotions without registering the environment around you, which is participating in those emotions and in which those emotions rise up. And so in Akam poetry, the poet's intention is to break down the barrier between subjectivity and world. This is 2,000 years ago. It's kind of what eco-poets are just coming to now in the rest of the world, but it's a precedent for thinking about the relationship between us and the communities that support and comprise us. So it turns out that California, in Akam poetry in southern India, there are 5 basic landscapes that recur because there are 5 basic landscapes there. But they happen to be the same 5 basic landscapes in California, where I live now. So I sort of imported the form, the idea, the philosophy, and used the landscapes of California to write the poems in Twice Alive.
Okay, so now if anybody would like to ask questions, make comments.
Okay, I have a question about the death caps in California. I was wondering, and it is connected with the metaphor, I was wondering if the death caps there are an invasive species simply because they found a niche for themselves, or are they invasive because they are really changing the ecosystem?
That's a really great question, and I don't know the answer to it, but I would like to. One of the things we're trying to think about right now is remarkably, nobody knows why poisonous mushrooms are poisonous. And by that I mean that they're poisonous to humans, yes, but it's very unlikely that they evolved the toxins to kill humans. I don't think they could care less. So then why? Because they're metabolically very expensive. And I wonder, but I have no data to offer you, that whether a part of the reason for the invasiveness of death caps is something about what those toxins are doing in California, in how they're mediating interactions. And maybe the answer to your question is probably all of those things are true. If I could spend enough lifetimes to studying them, maybe there's probably more than one thing happening to enable them to spread. But I don't know right now.
And in a related question, that crossing the ocean, I mean, I can't
Yeah.
imagine
So
that
that's
somebody
another.
carried a death cap
Well,
to
they
California.
carried plants, and then
Spores.
well, yeah, or they carried living plants with soil. So, for
Uh-huh.
example, the University of California at Berkeley prided itself on being a museum of living trees. So they brought in potted plants from all over the world, Canary Island pines, etc.
Uh-huh.
And when you plant something in your garden, when you plant a tree, if you're planting soil, you're planting everything that's in that soil, including beneficial fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, if there are pathogens there. So, talk about the persistence of dispersed worlds.
Yeah.
This is exactly the consequence of the persisting of a dispersed world. It's exactly, except that in this case, one of the the fungus jumped ship from the cork oak or whatever it was brought with, and now has decided to go on its own and form novel associations in our endemic forests.
When Anne gives talks like this and mentions the recent controversial work on like gender stuff, she's obliged to give people as they leave a death cap, so you can't talk about it.
Thank you so much for both parts of this single presentation, because I have the impression you've been talking about the same thing in very different, beautiful ways. So thank you. One of my questions is a follow-up question to the one we've heard before. Why did you choose that cemetery exactly? Because like 6 biologists laying next to each other, or 5. That's interesting. And my other question for Forrest. You published Not after working with Anne, your book Not, with in collaboration with Jack Shears. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact last name. Anyway, I was wondering how difficult or surprising for you it was to tune into this new kind of collaboration with a photographer after working with Anne on fungi and I think spending time in a wholly different environment while writing. So that's my second question. Thank you.
I'll give a quick answer. The cemetery, I knew the people, I knew the families, and I knew the people who take care of that cemetery. I'd had an experience before with a field site that was destroyed by an art museum that could have cared less about the fact that many of the species in the field where the art museum was built were undescribed. An undescribed species has no legal status. Therefore, I think it was the end of those fungi, but you can see a Henry Moore there now. So as you can tell, it was a not okay experience for many people, including me. So I was seeking a habitat that was sheltered for a long-term study, and I knew the people.
And I'm astonished that you've heard of this book, but after my wife C.D. Wright died, been carrying around lots of grief, and that's been finding its way into my work. And I met the husband of Ellsworth Kelly, the artist Ellsworth Kelly, is a photographer. His name is Jack Shear. And he asked me if I would write some poems for his images. And his images were very far away from grief. All of the images are of naked men wrestling or in some way engaged with a huge black cloth that sometimes covers almost everything. You just see a couple fingers sticking out, and sometimes are fairly erotically open. So it was an invitation to crawl out of death and grief into the body, and I took it as a challenge, and it opened up. That's the thing about collaboration, is that it brings out of you something that you might not have ever come to on your own. You give up something, and you gain something, which again sounds like lichen. Everything begins to sound like lichen.
Is it better now? Yes.
Yeah.
I have one question to you, Anne. I would like to ask you about the reasons of not naming certain living creatures, let's say. Is it only because of European colonialism
Oh,
in naming things? I guess it's something more.
it is something
About
more.
limiting those living.
Yeah,
I don't know,
yeah, we could have
creatures.
this conversation for a long time, but and I'm sorry, I sort of half believe what I'm about to say, which is I hate names. And what I've come to experience is that if we go together for a walk in the woods and we see something interesting, the first thing that you will ask me is, what is it? But what you're really asking is, what is its Latin binomial? And so then I'll give it to you, or not, depending on whether I know. And then 3 minutes later, I will come up to you and I will say, what is it? And you will have no idea. It's passed through you quickly. If instead, when you say, what is it, I resist giving you a name and I tell you a story. It turns the wood blue. It's alabaster white in the forest and beckons you like an angel. Those are things you will remember. So it's also true that in mycology the names are confusing and confused. I mean, it's a joke, but it's not a very funny one. This one about you're not a fungus unless you've been through 3 name changes. So I just think about, and I also, the other part of it is that for a long time mycology has been the science of naming. Like if you're a mycologist, everyone assumes, in a way that they don't assume for other disciplines, that what your work is describing new species. And that's not my work. I look at, a lichen and I try to ask how it grows, or I look at a death cap and try to understand why it's spreading, what's the environment around it, what's its genetics, what's its natural history. So it's a different way of doing mycology. So for all those reasons and probably more, I'm really resistant to the what is it? It's an Amanita phalloides. So that, yeah. In the US, common names are more stable than the Latin binomial. So a thing that's had the same common name for generations in a morel hunting region, for example, will have gone through, so what is it? It's a morel. The science of naming is really important, so I don't want to go overboard with that. But at least for one voice, I would stake my claim that way.
I have a question to Anne Pringle. I would like to ask you about the collaboration with artists and writers, like from your perspective, how you see it, what does it do?
I think the most important thing to me right now is that we are a world in crisis, and I don't know exactly what to do about it. I love what I do in the day-to-day. I love publishing scientific papers, sometimes in journals that people know, and sometimes in obscure journals, and I could do that happily for the rest of my life. But it feels like there's something else going on, and I don't know what to do about it, but this is a way of trying something else, finding another voice, finding someone who can speak for me. Or that was not right either, but do you know what I mean?
Speak with you.
Speak with me, yeah. Speak with me, or lead in a different way, in a different universe. So honestly, I don't know what else to do. Forrest and I were talking about this today. I also think about, I went solar in my house. I don't use paper cups. I also do individual things, but I don't think that the individual actions are necessary. I mean, I don't give up hope, but I'm not sure that individual actions are really the solution. Right now in the US anyway, there's a lot of pressure on individuals to solve the climate crisis. And I just don't think that is gonna work. reiterating, we went solar. I try not to use paper cups, or single-use plastics. But I just don't think in the long term it's about me not getting on airplanes, that's going to be the thing that solves it all. So I don't know what else to do. So that truly is the collaboration. Science is pretty closed. It's a pretty formal discipline. It doesn't always welcome outside collaborations or different ways of thinking. So it's not true that, for example, in my scientific papers, it's not, I don't know. I'm not sure many times, if I'm honest, I'm not sure I'm anytime soon going to put a poem in a scientific paper, although now I'll take that as a challenge and try. But I don't think, that's not what it's about. It's about somehow communicating differently. Science does have authority somehow. I think probably, for good reasons. And so if I can lend that authority somehow, that's also very useful. Give it away. Make it, make other voices more real somehow than they would be otherwise. I don't know. Yeah.
Speaking of the climate crisis, and I already asked you this today, Forrest, so, but I hope you will answer anyway. Do you think that poets have a responsibility when it comes to the climate crisis and other social issues, maybe? Poets and artists, of course.
Yeah. So I'm not in a position, or I'm not interested in telling other writers or artists what they should be doing. I think that each artist has to figure that out for herself. And but just the same, we're in the midst of one of the greatest crises in human history, and to not be concerned for it, to not want to write into it, seems mysterious to me. But I think we also we still need, things that make us laugh, and so I think they're different. Yeah, I know that I feel a responsibility that I want to address what I see as, I want to be a part of the critical issues of my time. If you're not invested in the major questions of your lifetime, what have you been doing?
Can I add something to an earlier question? One other thing that collaboration gives me is that the language of the phrase "twice alive" is the best description I've ever heard of symbiosis. And when I try to talk to people about it, now that's the phrase that I use. It's twice alive, or 3 times alive, or 100 times alive. And so the language itself is a gift. So just to say that that's something else. I mean, and it helps. You never know kind of what helps you think. And thinking is the hardest job. so that different tools, it's a tool that's incredibly useful. Yeah.
So remember, if you don't ask a question, you have to leave and you get the death cap on the way out. So.
So I just have a quick question to Forrest. By the way, thank you so very much for wonderful talks and discussion. So I'm going to refer to one of the previous questions. So what is it exactly that you have learned from Anne, from working, with a scientist? Could you briefly maybe discuss it or talk about it? Thank you.
One thing that lots of things, yeah. Like Anne's refusal, the disinterest in naming things, in immediately controlling something, which seems very male to me, that she thinks that kind of claim on otherness shuts down the possibilities of a more interesting line of questioning. So her interest in the question seems to drive her work, not in specific answers. That's exciting to me, and as a method that I'm interested in also. Her resistance to metaphor and to the sentimentality that can be a part of the way creative writers take on science is important to me too, because I also see that. And she's, you know, she puts her foot down, and I think that helps my perspective. So those things, and then just the joy of her knowledge and her joy with sharing it. It literally opened up a world to me that I didn't expect to see. And what a gift.
Thank you for the wonderful talks. Forrest, I wanted to ask you about geology and poetry. I'm very curious about the relationship between the two, not just biographically speaking in terms of your career and education, but on the surface, obviously, these two seem to be poles apart. But then, as we learn more about matter and its creativity, perhaps, and then on the other hand, when we learn more about, or perhaps as we see poetry and literature and the humanities approach topics of deep time, for example, or questions related to, you know, large-scale phenomena, such as with climate change. I was wondering whether there is maybe a common ground between the two. It seems like you've been exploring a little bit of that in core samples. But that, as I understand, is more like a method. But also I was curious whether perhaps in poetry there is something maybe going on, like, I don't know, sedimentation or erosion. What's your take on this?
Well, to start with time, which you mentioned, I mean, this crisis that we're living in has brought geological time and human time closer than they've ever been before. The changes that are happening now are happening so quickly. It's a phenomenon that those times are brought together. And our awareness of the earth as something that is involved with us, that speaks to us literally, that radiates energy that affects us, that we're affected by what we walk on. There's a great American poet named George Oppen who says, "The self is no mystery. The mystery is that there is something for us to stand on, the act of being more than oneself." And I really like the idea that what we stand on physically can be connected to what we stand on ethically, philosophically. Geology trained me to study geology is to constantly be tacking back and forth between large-scale systems. You have to look at a mountain range and see the folding patterns and the fault line, and then you have to, before you understand really what's gone on, you have to be able to look at the crystal structure in that shear zone to see what's going on. So you're constantly going between very particular detailed looking and considering, and large-scale considering. And that really helped me with my poetry, because I think that's that is a way of seeing more fully and checking and balancing what we see. So geology really informed my poetics. Do you have a background in geology? No. Uh-huh. It's not too late.
Thank you. So I have another question about the DevCaps. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I understand correctly, but I was wondering if they can reproduce by themselves, and they've got like the same genes. Would that mean that if there's any differences between like the individuals, if we can talk about individuals here, would that mean that they are only shaped by the environment and not like some genetics? And what could that tell us about how the environment influences these mushrooms?
Great questions, and I love your necklace, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so you understood it exactly correctly. It's an individual or a body that can reproduce by itself. It doesn't need another. It's by itself, and so all of its progeny, all of the baby mushrooms, will be exactly like it. So you're right. So it's genetically uniform as far as we know. Right, there are tricky things that can happen in the genetics of fungi, such that, you know, we could talk about it. But as far as we know, it's reproducing itself by itself, and so in that case, yeah, it's interesting. Its relationship with the environment has changed, because biologists think one of the fundamental drivers of mixing up the genes in every generation is that each generation sort of has there are a new suite of different mixes of genes, and somehow that those can interact with the environment in particular ways. Where if it's just uniform, if I'm just making more of exactly myself in the next generation, presumably that next Anne will have the same patterns. Although there are some nuances there too. So yeah, you've got it exactly right, and it is interesting to think about these questions a lot. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to all of you for coming tonight, and it is possible now to, if you have a book, you can perhaps it could be signed. Yeah, and well, have a great night.
Death caps on the way out. Julia has them in her purse.